Welcome to the Trauma-Informed Practice Training for Trainers e-learning course. This module is part of the Common Core 3.0 Training for Trainers series and will take approximately 60 minutes to complete. This module will cover the key terms related to childhood traumatic stress and provide a foundation for understanding trauma-informed practice and child welfare. Trauma-informed practice is integrated throughout all of the blocks in Common Core 3.0. Many activities within the classroom modules prompt trainees to think with a trauma lens, taking into account how the trauma experiences of children, parents, and even their own personal experiences impact engagement and assessment practices. As a trainer, you have a lot of opportunities in the classroom to help trainees see the presence and impact of trauma in their day-to-day practice. You also have a unique role in responding to secondary or vicarious trauma as it comes up in the classroom. By providing a safe space for these discussions and reinforcing self-care for the trainees, you are helping to create an environment where social workers and families thrive. Let's take a moment to review the learning objectives for this course. K1. Understand key terms and definitions related to trauma. K2. Identify the 9 essential elements of trauma-informed child welfare practice. K3. Recognize the trainer's role in supporting trauma-informed child welfare practice. K4. Identify the trainer's role in identifying secondary or vicarious trauma in the classroom and how to support self-care of trainees. V1. Appreciate the role of child welfare staff in preventing or mitigating the impact of traumatic stress through trauma-informed practice. V2. Respect the role of the social worker in providing trauma-informed interventions to children and families. Common Core 3.0 is closely aligned with the California Child Welfare Core Practice Model, utilizing common components and elements. Trauma-informed practice is specifically referenced in the practice of engagement, where the expectation is clearly stated. We use solution-focused, trauma-informed engagement practices and approach all interactions with openness, respect, and honesty. The California Child Welfare Core Practice Model emphasizes that families are the experts on themselves. It is through inquiry and exploration that we learn more about a family and gain a better understanding about how trauma may have impacted their lives and the lives of their children. By honoring the family's experience, we can be partners in the healing process. You will find the concepts of engagement, inquiry and exploration, teaming, and advocacy woven throughout CORE. By incorporating these concepts that support trauma-informed practice and child welfare, we are striving to create a trauma-informed workforce who can assist families in healing from trauma and accessing resources that create long-term support and stability. It is important for trainers to have a strong base knowledge of terms and definitions. We will begin by exploring some of the information provided to trainees in e-learning and classroom modules related to trauma-informed practice. Child traumatic stress refers to the physical and emotional responses of a child to events that threaten the life or the physical integrity of the child or someone critically important to the child, such as a parent or a sibling. Such events overwhelm a child's capacity to cope and elicit intense physical and emotional reactions that can be as threatening to the child's sense of physical and psychological safety as the traumatic event itself. Reactions to a traumatic event can include an overwhelming sense of terror, helplessness, and horror, and physical sensations such as rapid heart rate, trembling, dizziness, or loss of bladder or bowel control. There are many situations that can be traumatic for children. This may include physical and sexual abuse, abandonment, betrayal of trust, such as abuse by a caregiver, or neglect, the death or loss of a loved one, life-threatening illness in a caregiver, witnessing intimate partner violence, automobile accidents or other serious accidents, bullying, life-threatening health situation or painful medical procedures, witnessing or experiencing community violence, such as drive-by shootings, fights at school, and robbery, life-threatening natural disasters, and acts or threats of terrorism. A single traumatic event that is limited in time is called acute trauma. Some examples of acute trauma are serious accidents, community violence, natural disasters, sudden or violent loss of a loved one, physical or sexual assault, and school shootings. During an acute event, children go through a variety of feelings, thoughts, and physical reactions that are frightening in and of themselves and contribute to a sense of being overwhelmed. Chronic trauma refers to the experience of multiple traumatic events. One prevalent form of chronic trauma is child neglect, defined as the failure to provide for a child's basic physical, medical, educational, and emotional needs. Neglect can have serious and lifelong consequences, particularly for very young children who are completely dependent on caregivers to meet their needs. Experiencing neglect can feel acutely threatening. Neglect often occurs in the context of other maltreatment, such as periods of abandonment and abuse, and is frequently associated with other stressors and forms of adversity, such as extreme poverty and parental substance abuse. Long-term effects of child neglect include impaired brain development, poor physical health, cognitive deficits, developmental delays, insecure attachment, and behavioral problems. These poor outcomes are exacerbated when the neglect occurs repeatedly. The effects of chronic trauma are often cumulative, as each event serves to remind the child of prior trauma and reinforce its negative impact. Another source of chronic trauma is the exposure to community violence. Youth and young adults who live in neighborhoods where they have a high exposure to violent events through the perpetration of, victimization from, witnessing, and hearing about violence may suffer from a range of mood disorders and distress, including anxiety and depression. Complex trauma is a term used by some experts to describe both exposure to chronic trauma, usually caused by adults entrusted with the child's care, such as parents or caregivers, and the immediate and long-term impact of such exposure on the child. According to the article Complex Trauma in Early Childhood by Kim Cross, LSCSW, psychological trauma in early childhood can have a tremendous negative impact as it can distort the infant, toddler, or young child's social, emotional, neurological, physical, and sensory development. This is especially true of young children who have experienced multiple and/or chronic adverse interpersonal traumatic events through the child's caregiving system. Experts in the traumatic stress field have developed the term complex trauma to identify this form of trauma. Children who have experienced complex trauma have often endured multiple interpersonal traumatic events from a young age. When trauma is associated with the failure of those who should be protecting and nurturing a child, it has profound and far-reaching effects on nearly every aspect of the child's development and functioning. Let's explore the areas of development and functioning that are impacted. Attachment. Trauma-exposed children may feel that the world is uncertain and unpredictable. They can become socially isolated and can have difficulty relating to and empathizing with others. Biology. Children impacted by trauma may experience changes in brain chemistry and structure and higher levels of stress hormones. They may show hypersensitivity to physical contact. Many of these children exhibit unexplained physical symptoms and increased medical problems. Mood regulation. Children exposed to trauma can have difficulty regulating their emotions as well as difficulty understanding and describing their feelings and internal states. Dissociation. Trauma-exposed children may experience a feeling of detachment or depersonalization, as if they are observing something happening to them that is unreal. Behavioral control. Children who have been traumatized can show poor impulse control, self-destructive behavior, and aggression towards others. Cognition. Children exposed to trauma can have problems focusing on and completing tasks, or problems planning for and anticipating future events. Some exhibit learning difficulties and problems with language development. Self-concept. Trauma-affected children frequently suffer from disturbed body image, low self-esteem, shame, and guilt. Development. Trauma can disrupt developmental processes and interfere with the mastery of age-appropriate tasks and skills. Children involved with the child welfare system are likely to have experienced both acute and chronic trauma. The characteristics of their home environment generally include sources of ongoing stress, such as poverty and an inability by their caregivers to meet their needs or provide consistent support to mitigate the impact of the trauma. It is important for child welfare workers to recognize the complexity of a child's lifetime trauma history and to not focus solely on the single event that may have initiated the child welfare intervention. Children who have been exposed to repeated stressful events within an environment of abuse and neglect are more vulnerable to experiencing traumatic stress. A recent study conducted by National Child Traumatic Stress Network colleagues examining data from a large data set found that by the time youth in foster care are 17 years old, 62% of them will exhibit both the symptoms of a mental health disorder and the symptoms of trauma. Children in the child welfare system frequently face other sources of ongoing stress that can challenge workers' ability to intervene. Some of these sources of stress include poverty, discrimination, separations from parents or siblings, frequent moves, school problems, traumatic grief and loss, and refugee or immigrant experiences. Remember that most children and families involved in the child welfare system have been exposed to multiple traumatic events. By learning about the different types of trauma that can impact children and families, social workers are better able to support families and ensure that families receive trauma-informed interventions. The impact of a potentially traumatic event is determined by both the objective nature of the event, what happened, and the child's subjective response to it, how the event was perceived. Something that is traumatic for one child may not be traumatic for another. Several factors that may influence how a child experiences trauma include the child's age and developmental stage, the child's perception of the danger faced, whether the child was a victim or a witness, the child's relationship to the victim or perpetrator, the child's past experience with trauma, the adversities the child faces following the trauma, and the presence or availability of adults who can offer help and protection. Please refer to the handout titled Age-Related Reactions to a Traumatic Event from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network for more information about child's age and developmental stages in relationship to trauma. When faced with people, situations, places, or things that remind a person of traumatic events, they may re-experience the intense and disturbing feelings tied to the original trauma. These trauma reminders can lead to behaviors that seem out of place in the current situation, but were appropriate and perhaps even helpful at the time of the original traumatic event. Children who have experienced trauma may face so many trauma reminders in the course of an ordinary day that the whole world seems dangerous and no adult seems deserving of trust. Child welfare workers are in a unique position to help these children recognize safety and begin to trust adults who do indeed deserve their trust. It's very difficult for children in the midst of a reaction to a trauma reminder to calm themselves, especially if they do not understand why they are experiencing such intense feelings. Despite reassurance, these children may be convinced that danger is imminent or that the bad thing is about to happen again. It is therefore critical to create as safe an environment as possible. Children who have experienced trauma need repeated reassurances of their safety. When a child is experiencing a trauma reminder, it is important to state very clearly and specifically the reasons why the child is now safe. Each time a child copes with a trauma reminder and learns once more that he or she is finally safe, the world becomes a little less dangerous and other people a little more reliable. While we have reviewed what trauma reminders might look like for children, it is also important to remember that the parents of children in care may also be responding to interventions by the child welfare system with a trauma response. Please take some time to read the National Child Traumatic Stress Network resource, Birth Parents with Trauma Histories and the Child Welfare System, a guide for child welfare staff. Now that you have a better understanding of the concepts you may come across in the Common Core 3.0 curriculum, we will review the essential elements of trauma-informed child welfare practice. As a trainer, our hope is that you will emphasize and highlight these practices as often as possible. By helping to make trauma-informed practice more visible, we are reinforcing the need for social workers to identify and respond to trauma in a caring and empathetic manner. We will take a look at each essential element in more detail, exploring why it is essential and ways that you can support this practice in the classroom. Let's begin with essential element 1, maximize the child's sense of safety. Traumatic stress overwhelms a child's sense of safety and can lead to a variety of survival strategies for coping. After traumatic events are over, a child may continue to experience insecurity, both physically and emotionally. A sense of safety is critical for physical and emotional growth and functioning, appetite, digestion, and sleep. Both physical and psychological safety are important at home and within service settings. Some ways that this can be highlighted in the classroom include considering a child's trauma history when developing safety plans with parents and the child's team, utilizing SDM when making decisions about out-of-home care, and weighing the trauma of separation when developing an out-of-home safety plan. Encouraging social workers to practice how they will have conversations about safety with the child, parents, and their team. Being honest and transparent about the safety concerns is critical to creating a safety plan. Number 2, assist children in reducing overwhelming emotion. Trauma can result in such intense fear, anger, shame, and helplessness that the child feels overwhelmed by their emotions. Some ways that this can be highlighted in the classroom include encouraging communication with the child's team and other important adults about the child's trauma history. This helps others to understand what the child may be experiencing and respond in a way that promotes healing. When difficult behaviors are identified for both children and parents, help to normalize these emotions. Help social workers to see that a child or parent's response is understandable when considering the trauma they experienced. Allow social workers to practice ways of coping with strong emotions and talking about trauma. Sometimes social workers can identify trauma but don't know what to do about it. Encourage social workers to engage in kind and compassionate conversation with children and parents to better understand how the trauma has impacted the family. Number 3, help children make new meaning of their trauma history and current experiences. Traumatic experiences may be difficult for children to communicate, which may limit their ability to talk to others or receive support from others. Children need to feel safe enough to face emotional experiences, begin to make sense out of what happened to them, and express this to others. Some ways that this can be highlighted in the classroom include encouraging the use of tools, such as the safety house or 3 houses, to gather information about the child's trauma history. By understanding the child's worries and what makes them feel safe, social workers are able to get a full picture of the child's trauma history. No matter how it is done, having the child's voice and choice present in all decisions is critical to ensuring their well-being. Although it is sometimes difficult to talk about, and the social worker may not want to re-traumatize the child by talking about what happened, it is important for social workers to practice how they will have conversations with children and families about what has happened and the reason for child welfare's involvement, and ensuring that everyone has accurate information. Social workers sometimes struggle with how to explain the child welfare intervention with the child. By allowing social workers to practice this in the classroom, they will improve their skill in communicating honestly and accurately in an age-appropriate way. Number 4, address the impact of trauma and subsequent changes in the child's behavior, development, and relationships. Traumatic events can affect many aspects of the child's life beyond the initial trauma response and may create new or secondary problems. The effects can include difficulties in school and relationships, or health-related problems and substance abuse. Problems in these areas may be so extreme, pronounced, or troublesome that they mask other underlying traumatic stress symptoms. Some ways that this can be highlighted in the classroom include helping social workers to look beyond problem behaviors to see what trauma response may be underlying the issue. The trainer has an opportunity to help the social worker to see how trauma may present itself in interactions with parents and children. By helping social workers to understand trauma responses, they are better able to help caregivers and others understand the problem behavior. An example of this may include a caregiver reporting to the social worker some concerns they have about the child's aggressive behavior in their home. Rather than jumping immediately to a behavioral intervention, it would be beneficial to spend some time understanding what happens before the behavior or after. Are there any patterns? Is it possible that the child is having a response to a trauma reminder? And these are just a few of the questions that can help the social worker understand more about what is happening for that child. It is like peeling an onion. We need to get underneath the surface of what we see. Number 5, coordinate services with other agencies. Traumatized children and their families are often involved with multiple service systems, including law enforcement, child welfare, the courts, schools, primary care, and behavioral health. In contrast to a fragmented approach, cross-system coordination views the child as a whole person. Some ways that this can be highlighted in the classroom include reinforcing the idea of teaming as a process rather than an event. The process of identifying team members and communicating with them is just as critical as conducting the meeting itself. By creating teams around children and families, social workers are promoting healthy, long-term relationships. Through use of coordinated service delivery, the social worker is able to monitor and adapt the case plan with the family as needed, while keeping the team informed along the way. Monitoring the plan within the team setting helps to clarify roles and responsibilities of all members of the team to meet the safety goal. Number 6. Utilize comprehensive assessment of the child's trauma experiences and their impact on the child's development and behavior to guide services. Millions of children experience some sort of trauma every year. Short-term effects may include behavioral difficulties or emotional and health problems. Long-term effects might include depression, anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, delinquency, substance abuse, and relationship problems. A thorough assessment helps to determine the type and severity of the symptoms, as well as determines possible interventions. Proper assessment provides a basis for the development of treatment goals and measurable objectives designed to reduce the negative effects of trauma. Some ways that this can be highlighted in the classroom include helping social workers to speak in behaviorally specific language and identify safety threats or harm in addition to complicating factors. Utilizing assessment tools such as safety mapping to gather and sort important information. Use of SDM assessment tools such as the Family Strengths and Needs Assessment to help guide case planning and service delivery. Number 7. Support and promote positive and stable relationships in the life of the child. Children form and maintain relationships to important figures in their lives through bonding and attachment. Being separated from an attachment figure, particularly under traumatic circumstances, can be very stressful for a child. Within the child welfare system, the risk of separation from parents, siblings, and other important people is common. Child welfare workers can play a huge role in encouraging and promoting positive relationships in a child's life and minimizing the extent to which these relationships are disrupted. Some ways that this can be highlighted in the classroom include encouraging social workers to work with the family to identify members of their safety network. Tools that social workers can utilize include a safety circle, ecomap, or genogram. Challenge stereotypes and bias about families involved in the child welfare system. You may sometimes hear comments like, "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." It is important to identify this as a possible bias and provide a different perspective, such as the importance of maintaining relationships. Visitation and family time are just a couple of ways to support a child's connection with people who are important to them. Teaming is a way to engage the safety network and mobilize the team to be active participants in the safety plan. Being culturally humble and taking the family's lead on what type of interaction and intervention is best for their family, in addition to honoring family traditions and norms within the context of the safety plan. Number 8. Provide support and guidance to the child's family and caregivers. Children experience their world in the context of family relationships. Parents, family, and other caregivers are the full-time and long-term loving supports for their children. Improving the coping skills within a child's caregiving system will help promote resiliency. It is critical to support those caring for a child by listening, including them in decisions about the child, and being responsive to their needs. Some ways that this can be highlighted in the classroom include bringing the team together from the beginning of the case and ongoing. A few examples of team meetings include team decision-making meetings, child and family team meetings, family team meetings, safety mapping meeting, family group conference, emancipation conference. Provide support to the child, parent, and caregiver by ensuring that their voice and choice is present in all interactions. Be aware of cultural considerations for the child, parent, and caregiver when considering how to address a concern they have. Number 9. Manage professional and personal stress. There have been multiple terms used to designate exposure to the trauma experienced in one's role as a helper. 4 terms that are most common are countertransference, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and secondary traumatic stress. Just as with the children themselves, social workers who work with children and families who have been victims of trauma are at risk of experiencing alterations in their thinking about their world, in their feelings, in their relationships, and in their lives. Some ways that this can be highlighted in the classroom include encouraging social workers to utilize peer support and create space within the classroom for this during breaks and lunchtime. Create a classroom environment that normalizes and does not stigmatize getting help for behavioral health difficulties. Engage in self-care behavior in the classroom, such as conscious relaxation, deep breathing, and exercise. Self-care activities are noted in multiple places in the trainer activity guide. As a trainer, you are encouraged to explore ways that trainees can care for themselves and reduce compassion fatigue. By modeling engagement, inquiry, and empathetic listening, you are creating a space for the social worker to be heard and learn ways to manage the emotions and feelings associated with this work. Your role in the classroom is critical for social workers to learn the needed information and skills to engage in best practices with families. It is important for you to have a trauma lens when facilitating classroom activities and interacting with new social workers. The first step is for social workers to recognize when trauma may be present. As social workers share their experiences in the classroom, your role is to help them think critically about how a family's trauma or their own trauma may impact any given interaction. We appreciate the time you have spent to become more familiar with trauma-informed practice in child welfare. You are also encouraged to participate in the Trauma-Informed Practice e-learning course that is a prerequisite for the Trauma-Informed Practice classroom. Contact your regional training academy for more information about how to enroll. Additional resources are available on the next slide for you to access on your own.